country today. I'm from Bangalore, like I said, and in Bangalore there's a fairly mature model. Having said that, there's a mature model. The last check which has gone out to clients for their net metering is 2015. Government is very slow. People don't realize. In fact, solar implementers refuse to come and do net metering paperwork simply because they say they don't believe the money will ever come from the government. So there is lack of action from the government too. It's one side is a policy, one side is action on net metering and gross metering. The other thing is what we've noticed in rooftop solar is grid incapability or lack of dependency on grid makes battery very important. And battery becoming important makes the cost go up by another 40%. Again, we are not solar experts, we are experts in providing solutions to our clients. And these are some of the challenges we are seeing. And there are, like I said, there are two sides. We love to bring about reduction in consumption, and we want to tell people how they should look at a holistic way and fundamentally change in the adoption of renewable energy. And that's what we do. That's what I would like to bring to the table. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Shande, Dr. Sinha, Mr. Garud, and Sriram, and Mr. Goswami. May I now request you to, pardon? We are trying to skip it.
Thank you, sir. May we request Mr. Arun Mukherjee to please present mementos to our speakers. Dr. Bikas Sinha. Mr. Sriram Kuchimanchi. Dr. Sonde. Mr. Garur. And Mr. Goswami. Thank you. We will have our valedictory session now. We would request Dr. Kirit Parekh to please come to the stage, and Mr. Debe Mukherjee. We will take just a minute to make the changeover.
We are just waiting for Dr. Parekh to join us. He'll be here in a minute or so.
মাঝেরটা আগে করো, মাঝেরটা আগে করো, ওটা পরে করো, আগে মাঝেরটা করো।
Sir, please.
May we request Mr. Debe Mukherjee to please take the session forward?
We are indeed very fortunate to have Dr. Kirit Parikh with us this afternoon to address the valedictory session of the 9th Environment and Energy Conclave. Dr. Parikh has been with us for the last several years, and it is rather befitting that he addresses us at the valedictory session, summing up the day's proceedings in a way, and talking about business opportunities in this era of energy-climate synergy. I would now request Dr. Parikh to please take the floor and address the audience.
Shri Mukherjee and distinguished participants here. I think we have heard for the whole day the kind of challenges that the country faces in terms of meeting its climate change threat. Or, of course, with almost every challenge there is an opportunity also of doing something about it. And we know that we have begun to grapple with this with the announcement of our INDC and raising the target of renewables from 20 gigawatt to 175 gigawatt by 2022. We should also recognize that 2022 is just an intermediate date, that INDCs are only up to 2030, and that we will still need to go even beyond that, and a lot more needs to be done. So, India's energy future, if you have to see, you have to keep this in mind, that we have to go to 2050, and that the pressure on the country to do more reduced emissions and so on would keep on mounting, so that we really have to do this. In a sense, it's very unfortunate, because if you look at it, the contribution that India has made to the threat of climate change is virtually zero. I mean, if you see that every year, whatever emissions are made, about more than 50% are absorbed in the natural systems, in oceans and so on, and only the remaining gets accumulated into the atmosphere. And the global climate change threat arises from the stock of accumulated greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So if you were to allocate those absorptive capacity of the natural environment to the inhabitants of the earth on an equal per capita basis, and if you were to cumulate just from 1990 onwards to 2015, you would find that India's contribution is virtually zero. We haven't done any significant contribution, yet we need to take action because we are highly vulnerable. We need to encourage people to do something, and particularly the developed countries, the industrialized countries. And I thought the INDC announcement and India's role at Paris was really to stimulate this by India's actions, to perhaps you could say stimulate, encourage, shame the Americans and others to take some action on the climate change, to do something. Because someone with very little responsibility is willing to take this action, others have to do so. Now what can we do? You have heard many things today. How can we reduce this? One has to say, a number of people have argued that coal requirement will keep on growing, that we will really need to rely on coal for generating electricity. Some observations have also been made that we can really increase the generation without increasing coal by increasing the efficiency of generation. And I think that's a very important point that I want to underline. For example, if you have 1,000 megawatt of ultra supercritical coal-based plant, instead of 1,000 megawatt of subcritical coal-based plant, the coal consumption will go down by 25 to 30%. And to reduce the same amount of coal consumption that you will have with an ultra supercritical coal-based plant, you would need perhaps 1,000 megawatt of solar power plants. But the cost involved in setting up that 1,000 megawatt solar power plant would be 5 to 6 times the cost of just changing from a subcritical to ultra supercritical power plant. So there are trade-offs available. Should we go for solar? Should we go for coal efficiency? This is an area which we must really also explore and examine further. Now, if you also look at the fact that there are the target of 175 megawatt of renewables is really a challenging target, and I would say a game-changing one. But the question that one can ask is, should we have such a target or should we have a lower target? Could we reach this target? And finally, how can we reach this target? And what will be the cost of doing that? And one of the things one has to recognize that coal-based power plant cost maybe 4 crores a megawatt, and a solar plant cost, even with a reduced cost, something like 5.5 to 6 crores a megawatt. But a coal-based power plant generates over a year, works for 8,000 hours, 7,000 to 8,000 hours, and a solar plant operates only for 1,600 hours. Therefore, to replace 1 megawatt of coal-based power, we need to invest in 5 megawatts of solar power. So instead of 4 crores, we need to invest perhaps 20 to 25 crores of rupees upfront. And therefore, I think one has to recognize that there is a trade-off between how we allocate our investment. Does it go for renewables? Does it go for health, education, energy efficiency, or what have you? So I think that's one thing. Now suppose we say, okay, we are going to be funded by others, that people will provide you long-term cheap loans, international community, for putting up solar-based power plant, which surely we should go for that. But then the question comes, how do we attain this 175 megawatt rooftop standards? 75 megawatt renewable standards. Particularly the question is raised about 100 megawatt of solar. 40 megawatts are supposed to come from, 40,000 megawatts are supposed to come from rooftop solar plants. Now, one of the problems with a rooftop solar plant, if it is on one should not subsidize rooftop solar plants, I would argue, because only the rich or relatively well-off have a rooftop. So subsidizing a rooftop would be subsidizing the relatively well-off. That's one problem. The second problem is that if I put a rooftop solar plant and maybe use bulk of my electricity comes from that, but at night, if I don't have storage, at night I will need to rely on the grid. So the grid has to maintain capacity, which was earlier running at 60% or 65% load factor, has now a load factor of 20% or 15%. So I would say the correct kind of a policy we should really have is that don't give a subsidy for a rooftop for individuals, but say you have a rooftop, you pay an additional capacity charge to the grid so that you can continue to maintain the grid's viability, and the poor who rely on the grid continue to get their electricity. So I think it is important to perhaps make the system really competitive and transparent so that all the costs and all the even indirect costs are borne by those who benefit from it. I would also argue, I mean, we have also had, apart from rooftop, there is now, we need to encourage industrialists and others to go in for solar plant. And what has been happening now is that in, for example, Tamil Nadu's renewable power generation from wind, there are not enough buyers. And one way to solve this problem is to have a proper renewable portfolio obligation imposed on others. The government has recently announced a renewable portfolio obligation guidelines, which puts up a very strong, you could say, very targets, so that, you know, if they are fulfilled, then we can reach this target of 100 megawatt. And it provides separate renewable portfolio obligation for solar and other renewables. Now, the general idea of a renewable portfolio obligation compared to, let's say, a feed-in tariff would be that in a renewable portfolio obligation, the price gets determined in a market-based mechanism. Secondly, with an RPO, what you get is that you can be independent of technologies. The best available technology would be used. So giving a separate RPO for solar and separate RPO for other renewables doesn't quite make sense unless you say it is only geared to get my 100 megawatt of solar target. Even then one can raise the question, why have a 100 megawatt of solar target, just not only, why not have only 175,000 gigawatts, sorry I keep mixing up megawatt, gigawatt, 175 gigawatt of renewable, because then one can say whichever is the cheapest form of renewable, you will follow that. Whatever it is, the problem with that is that many of the states are saying that this is unfair to us. We don't have, you know, renewable opportunities, and we will have to pay high price for this. Unless you have a national grid which is consistently operated, you won't be able to have a uniform renewable portfolio obligation in the country. And it would be also, one might also want to ask a question, is that any renewable portfolio obligation that you impose, the objective should be not only to have a very an efficient, economically efficient, low-cost system of power generation, but also to have something that has a relatively equitable burden is imposed on the consumers across the country in different parts of the country. So that you need to make some differentiation of how the burden of that additional cost of renewables is borne by different consumers in different parts of the country. And one needs to work out how we can do these things. But now I think one can also say that we need, I mean, one could also then look at, say, fine, we should tweak the renewable portfolio obligations, we should enforce it properly, do this, but part of it is a state thing, but state government obligations, and might be difficult, but hopefully someday we can arrive at a consensus among all states and have an appropriate policies. The question now would be that really what kind of opportunities does this create for business, this whole idea of climate change related policies create for business community. You know, energy efficiency, as again was pointed out by a number of people, is one of the most important resource that we have, And that's the resource that we should really exploit fully. And I think here one really can see a lot of opportunity for business to do something. I think one has to recognize that there is going to be need for this, recognize that you will have to be energy efficient. So think ahead of time, make your investments and as clean and green as possible, and recognize that you will have to compete with the world and in a situation where this is going to be this. So at least even if you don't make your plant completely green at the moment, at least provide for possibilities of retrofitting it 5 or 10 years down the line. And let me give you some example of how important it is to anticipate what changes can come in the future. Sometimes in the early 90s we were in Mumbai at the Indira Gandhi Institute, and Dr. Jyoti Parikh was doing a study on this energy and emissions, and she asked Bajaj scooters fellows, what are you doing about developing a 4-stroke scooter? And they said, no, that's not in our thing. We are too busy making this and selling this, and we have no time for 4-stroke scooters. Around that time we had gone to Bangladesh and we were talking to some of our friends who were doing this, and they said, Bangladesh, Bajaj was the generic term for scooters and 3-wheelers. So they would say, take a Bajaj le lo, auto rickshaw nahi, say Bajaj le lo. So you're going from one place to other, say take a Bajaj. That was the kind of way Bajaj had captured that market. 3-4 years later, meanwhile, when the Japanese had introduced a 4-stroke scooter and we went to Bajaj, the same friend saying with glee, Bajaj ko bhaga diya. Because then, Dhaka was getting so polluted, so noisy that they thought getting rid of Bajaj was a great idea. So the Bajaj to bhaga diya. Of course, Bajaj has currently recognized this. Now they are doing a lot of innovations. But I am telling this story in order to drive the point that it is important to anticipate the kind of changes that will come and be prepared. And at least in this area, energy efficiency is going to be an extremely important role that industries would have to keep in mind and plan it in a way that their investments don't become non-competitive in few years' time. I think another thing is that we have to recognize that electric vehicles will come, and I think the story was told about electric vehicles, how people were reluctant to even make an effort to give 2 simple electric vehicles, sell it to Bhutan, and it's really, that's the kind of mistakes one should not make. You should recognize that electric vehicles are are going to be here, and that we need to really think in terms of how your system, your whole operations will change. I think electric 2-wheelers can be really there before we know. In many of our cities, they might be ubiquitous in a short while of time. But the other area that I think there is lots of opportunities maybe there is recognizing that microgrid and clusters of microgrid may be quite important to develop, and there is an opportunity for doing innovative work here, so that you can say that we are going to have, one microgrid may not be worth your while to do, but if you have 100 microgrids that you operate simultaneously in 100 clusters of villages, then you might say that it makes a business proposition and worthwhile doing to something that can then, sooner or later the main grid will come and you will have you can integrate with that. Other kinds of possibilities I think are there in some of these things. I think Dr. Sonde had pointed out the kind of innovations that are possible. Of course, there are often a large gap between new innovation in the laboratory and on the ground. But I think there are a few things which are already very important are coal-based methane, and there have been technical progress here which makes the extraction rate of coal-based methane much faster or higher than before, and so it becomes an economically attractive proposition. So by and large I would say that we in India have to take actions on climate change, that 175 gigawatt of renewables by 2022 may create problem for, if attained, may create problem for coal power plants because their consumption, their load factor will have to go down, and that some excess capacity would be there. But by and large we will need to have develop renewable capacity, solar and wind in the country in a substantial manner. And the studies we have done at my institute, the Integrated Research and Action for Development, IRADE, in Delhi, we have done a number of studies. In fact, we have done the modeling study behind the INDC to work out the implications of INDC on the economy for the MOEF. And the studies till 2050 show really that by 2050 we will need not 150 but maybe 600, 700 gigawatt of solar capacity and 300 and 400 gigawatt of wind capacity. This is up to the projected potential would be all exhausted, it would have to be developed by then. And even then I think we will still have 40% of our electricity coming from coal. So that yes, we have many different ways to many problems to overcome. But I mean, each of the problem poses some challenge and opportunity for growth. Thank you all.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Parekh, for giving us a very good overview of the discussions. You mentioned about taking a very practical view of things, getting the balance right, understand the trade-off, and most importantly, you mentioned about anticipation, and that's very important for from a business perspective. Maybe I'll also add with anticipation there's also got to be a bit of innovation that should be there as well. Sir, would it be possible for you to take just a couple of questions in case? Okay, we'll take a couple of questions. Yes, please.
I think that's certainly